In the last couple of months, Sony have released the A7R III and the A7 III, and a lot of people are starting to now question, are mirrorless cameras about to replace DSLRs? Have DSLRs had their heyday, and are they about to become ancient technology? And Marina Vieira has posed the same question to me and asked what I think of this situation. And the short answer is yes, I think mirrorless cameras are going to replace DSLRs. But let's discuss. I will be the first to admit that really until Sony brought out the A9, I was never convinced that mirrorless was truly going to replace DSLRs. I thought there would be target markets that mirrorless would favour over DSLRs, but I never really considered that DSLRs would be completely replaced by the mirrorless cameras. But since the A9, the A7R III, the A7 III, I can kind of see that it is going to go that way. Do I think it's going to be near future? It depends what you call by near future. Next 12 months? No. Next couple of years? More than likely. You know, there's no doubt that cameras like the A7R II, the A7S II were all showing the kind of image quality that you could get from a camera if you put your mind to it. You see, the whole argument of DSLRs versus mirrorless cameras, you have to look at them in their entirety. You can't just say, oh, well, that mirrorless camera is better than that DSLR, so therefore DSLRs must be dead and mirrorless are going to replace them. The key thing to remember is that mirrorless cameras to DSLRs, there is only one key difference: the mirror. Now you have to remember that every digital camera there's always been that isn't a DSLR. Mirrorless, compact, bridge cameras, they are all technically mirrorless cameras because they don't have a mirror inside. The only difference between a mirrorless and a compact or a bridge camera is that mirrorless has interchangeable lenses, whereas the others don't. But what does that mirror do? Well, the mirror was always for two purposes. One, the optical viewfinder. Two, the autofocus system. And think back a couple of years ago at most, electronic viewfinders were garbage. They weren't particularly high resolution, the refresh rates weren't particularly smooth, so compared to those, an optical viewfinder was always the better choice. And then there's the autofocus. Up until a couple of years ago, autofocus on a sensor was always done by contrast detection or a hybrid detection, which was never ever as quick and as responsive as a separate DSLR phase detection system. So in that respect, 5 or 6 years ago, DSLRs were always the obvious choice compared to any mirrorless or digital camera. You know, technology's forever improving, but DSLRs have kind of really hit the peak of what they can manage. You know, you can marginally improve the autofocus on a DSLR by adding extra autofocus points or by using a faster processor, but they're small improvements over every generation. Same with the viewfinder. There's not really much that you can do with the viewfinders to improve them. You know, they're about as bright as they can be. They're about as big as they can be. That's pretty much at the limit of what an optical viewfinder can now achieve. But then look at the mirrorless and how fast they are progressing. You know, the A9, the A7R III, the A7 III, all of them have EVFs that have much faster refresh rates and much clearer picture than the older mirrorless technology. So there might be certain instances where an optical viewfinder is still preferred to some individuals over an electronic viewfinder. But electronic viewfinders have still got that much more potential. You know, currently they're at kind of a 2 megapixel resolution and about 100 Hz refresh rate, but there's still so much more potential there. You know, the resolution can still go up, the refresh rate could still be increased to the point where you could be looking at an electronic viewfinder and have no idea that it's not an optical. Then there's the autofocus. I mean, look at the A7 III. It's got almost 700 phase detection points coupled with over 400 contrast detection points. So you're looking at over 1100 points that the camera is using to grab focus. And then compare that to the DSLRs, you're looking about 150 points at most from the top-end Nikons. Then there's the battery life and the overheating. You know, I was guilty of accusing Sony cameras of being hand warmers that would only last 5 minutes. But they are improving. Yes, the body's got to get a little bit bigger to allow a little bit more space for the heat management. And yes, mirrorless cameras still use more battery drain than a DSLR. So the only solution that they've had is to increase the capacity of the battery. The new Z-type battery that Sony are using is being well received for how much longer it lasts over the old version. but that's because it's rated up at 2300 milliamps. By comparison, the Canon LPE6 is only 1800 milliamps, but in a DSLR will still last longer than a mirrorless camera. You know, a lot of people jump to the defense of DSLRs and say, well, you know, I'm a sports and wildlife shooter. Compare up a Sony A9 to a 1DX Mark II. You know, the 1DX Mark II is a lot more rugged, it's a lot more robust and weather sealed, and it's got that bigger size body, which I like for using bigger telephoto lenses. And all of those are valid points. Sony could easily release a camera the size of a Canon 5D body. Except if it's an E-mount, that means the sensor can sit a lot closer to the front of the camera, which is going to open up all this space behind the sensor for extra heat management and the like, which means they can then push even more processing power through the camera and still manage the heat properly. Suddenly that's going to give you a camera with the ergonomics of a DSLR, but with performance that far outweighs anything that is currently on the market. Technology will always advance, and the newer technology will always supersede the older technology. It's just a fact of life. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. Look back at the old phone market. 15 years ago, everybody was buying Nokia. And to this day, the Nokia 3310 is still renowned as being built like a tank. You could drop that thing on the pavement and the concrete would break before the phone did. And people are finding those phones 10 years after they've had them, and the phone still got life in the battery. Except 10 years ago, smartphones became popular, even though they have a battery life like a moth and they break if you look at them wrong. Everybody these days has a smartphone because technology just progresses. And that's what's going to happen with the camera market. Over time, mirrorless cameras are going to just keep improving. And yes, DSLRs are going to improve in the sensor technology and stuff as well. But in terms of the autofocus ability, there's going to be so much more potential in what the mirrorless cameras can do over what the DSLRs can do. And I think we're on the top of that slope right now because a lot of people, myself included, are hugely drawn towards the A7 III. Because compare that to similarly priced DSLRs and it blows them out of the water. So as more people start to shift over to mirrorless cameras, that's going to give the mirrorless manufacturers more kind of persuasion to increase the lens lineup, which is then going to draw more people over. As a result, Canon and Nikon, who are the big two manufacturers of DSLRs at the minute, are going to have to respond by making their own mirrorless cameras as well. So that's going to pull their resources away from creating new DSLRs. So I think slowly but surely we are going to see a decline in DSLRs to the point where they basically become like old film cameras did. So that's my prediction. At some point, mirrorless is going to replace DSLR. It's just a matter of time. But what do you think? Do you think DSLRs have had their heyday? Do you think there's still more to get out of them? Leave your comment down below. Let me know what you think, and I will see you in the next video.